Go grab some more sparkling water from the back, would you? And while you're at it, tell whoever's running the bar that the Macallan is nearly gone." The new managing director didn't even look up from his phone when he said it. He just snapped his fingers twice in my direction, the way you might signal a passing cab, and went right back to his conversation with the hedge fund partner standing next to him. My younger sister, who had flown in from Portland specifically to see what one of these private equity charity events looked like, went completely still beside me. I watched her jaw tighten. She was 26 and still believed that moments like this required an immediate, loud response. I had learned, over many years and far more expensive lessons, that silence is often the sharper instrument. I smiled at the managing director's profile. He still hadn't looked at me. "Of course," I said. Then I took my sister's arm and walked us toward the terrace, where the autumn air off the lake smelled like cedar and cold water, and where no one was going to snap their fingers at anyone. What Marcus Webb did not know, what he could not have known because he had never once bothered to find out, was that I was the person who had approved the budget that funded his entire department. I was the one who had signed off on his compensation package, his corner office renovation, and the company credit card he used to expense those Macallan bottles in the first place. My name appeared on exactly 0 pieces of internal correspondence. It appeared on one document that mattered, the ownership agreement showing that my holding company, Clearwater Capital, controlled 54% of Meridian Venture Partners. I had been a shadow on the wall of that firm for 7 years. Tonight, I had decided to step into the light. The annual Meridian Charity Classic was held at the Lakewood Club, a private golf and dining establishment 40 minutes outside of Chicago. It was one of those places where the carpet was the same burgundy it had been in 1987, and the staff knew every member's drink order by heart. The charity beneficiary rotated each year. This year, it was a literacy foundation I personally chaired, which was another piece of information Marcus Webb had never troubled himself to learn. I had founded Meridian in 2016 with a philosophy that was probably considered eccentric at the time. Stay invisible. Let talented operators run the day-to-day. Intervene only when the fundamentals are breaking down. I had spent the previous decade as a quantitative analyst at a firm in Boston, saving aggressively, living in a 1-bedroom apartment, eating grocery store sushi more nights than I would ever admit publicly. When I finally had enough capital to make a serious move, I did it quietly. No press release, no LinkedIn announcement, no Forbes profile. The firm's founding CEO, a man named David Okafor, knew exactly who I was. We had worked together closely for the first 4 years. When David retired and recommended Marcus Webb as his successor, I had read Marcus's file carefully. Strong returns in his previous role, a reputation for decisive action, a network that opened doors. I had approved the hire. I had been present, by phone, for the final interviews. What I had not done was attend the in-person introduction dinner. My mother had been in the hospital that week. Some things matter more than business. By the time my mother recovered and I returned my attention to Meridian, Marcus had been managing director for 8 months. I monitored the numbers from a distance, as I always did. The returns were acceptable. The culture data, which I tracked through a quarterly anonymous survey I had built into the firm's HR infrastructure years before Marcus arrived, was not. I had been planning to address it for 3 months. Tonight had moved the timeline forward considerably. My sister found a server who was actually a server and got us both glasses of sparkling water. We stood at the terrace railing and looked out at the golf course, lit softly by the path lights running along the fairways. She started. "I know. Without even looking at you. I know. You own the company. 54% of it." She stared at me. "And you're not going to say anything?" "I'm going to say a great many things. Just not to him. Not tonight." I watched a couple cross the lit path below us, laughing at something. I wanted to see how he treated someone he thought was beneath him. Now I know. He failed. He did. She was quiet for a moment, turning her glass in her hands. You could have shut him down right there. Yes. And then he'd spend the next month believing he was the victim of an ambush, and nothing would actually change. This way, the conversation happens on my terms, in a setting where the facts speak for themselves. I looked at her. Our grandmother spent 32 years cleaning other people's houses. She never once let anyone make her feel small. Not because she didn't notice. Because she understood something those people never did. What? That dignity isn't something other people can take from you. They can only reveal their own lack of it. My sister looked back at the golf course. I'm going to need you to send me the recap of whatever happens next. You'll have a front row seat. You're coming to the office with me on Monday. Inside, the dinner portion of the evening was beginning. I guided my sister back in, found our table near the front, a placement I had arranged specifically, because the Literacy Foundation's chair always sat at table 1, a fact that was printed clearly in the event program that had been placed at every seat, and we sat down. Marcus Webb was at table 3. I watched his face when he glanced at the program, then at our table, then back at the program. I watched the exact moment the information assembled itself into something he didn't want to understand. He leaned toward the woman beside him and said something. She looked at our table too. Then she looked at Marcus with an expression that was not kind. I turned back to my sister and asked her about her new job, and we talked about Portland for the rest of dinner. By 7:30 the following morning, I was in the home office. I kept in the converted sunroom of my house in Lincoln Park. It was a modest space by most measures. A standing desk, 2 monitors, a whiteboard, covered in diagrams I had been refining for weeks. The view was of a small garden my neighbor maintained on her side of the fence, which was currently dormant for the season, all bare branches and mulched beds waiting for spring. I had started Meridian with a conviction that the venture capital industry had a structural problem. It concentrated decision-making power in a small group of people who tended to know each other, think like each other, and reward the traits they recognized in themselves. The returns were real, but the ceiling was artificial. I believed that a firm built on different principles could do significantly better. 7 years of data suggested I had been correct. What I had not paid sufficient attention to was what happened to a firm's internal culture when its leadership was not actively modeling those principles. I opened the quarterly survey dashboard. The numbers I had been watching for 3 months were still there, still troubling. Anonymous responses from across the 41-person team described an atmosphere that had shifted from collaborative to hierarchical. Words like dismissive, territorial, and invisible appeared with a frequency that told a clear story. Requests for meetings with senior leadership went unanswered for weeks. 3 junior analysts, 2 of them women, and 1 of them a first-generation professional, from a background remarkably similar to my own 15 years ago, had quietly begun exploring positions at other firms. I spent 2 hours drafting an agenda. Then I sent a single email to Marcus Webb and the 4 other senior partners. Monday, 9 a.m. All hands leadership session. Full attendance required. Topic: Strategic Culture Review and Q4 Operating Priorities. Please come prepared to discuss both. C. Roads. Clearwater Capital. The response came in 11 minutes. Marcus calling. I let it go to voicemail. His message was 47 seconds long and consisted primarily of the words, "I think we should talk before Monday," arranged in several different orders. I replied by text. Monday at 9 works well. See you then. My sister knocked on the sunroom door at 8:30 with 2 cups of coffee and the expression of someone who had been awake thinking about things. You're really doing this. I've been doing this for 3 months. Last night just clarified the sequence. I took the coffee. Sit down. I want to show you something. I walked her through the survey data. I showed her the retention risk flags the system had automatically generated when the 3 junior analysts' engagement scores dropped below threshold. I showed her the email response times, which had been tracked anonymously through metadata for operational efficiency purposes, and which showed a clear pattern of senior staff deprioritizing communication with junior team members. This is a lot of data, my sister said. Every decision I've ever made has been built on data. That's why it works. I closed the laptop. What happened last night matters because it's a symptom. A managing director who snaps his fingers at a woman he's decided is the help that behavior doesn't stay at charity dinners. It comes to work on Monday morning. It sits in every performance review, every meeting, every decision about who gets the interesting assignment and who gets told their input isn't needed. What are you going to do to him? That depends entirely on Marcus. The Monday morning session was held in Meridian's main conference room on the 23rd floor of a building on Michigan Avenue, where the windows faced the lake and the light was extraordinary on clear days. This was a clear day. 5 people sat around the table. Marcus, the 4 senior partners, and the head of people operations, a woman named Priya Subramaniam, who had been with the firm for 6 years and who I suspected had been waiting for this specific meeting for at least 3 of them. I sat at the end of the table opposite Marcus. He had chosen the head position, which was a choice that told me something useful. "Thank you all for being here," I said. "I want to start with the survey data, because I think it provides necessary context for everything else we're going to discuss. Priya, can you walk us through the Q3 findings?" Priya had the practiced composure of someone who had compiled these findings carefully and had thought hard about how to present them without sounding like an accusation. She was measured and precise. The numbers did the accusing themselves. Employee engagement scores had dropped 14 points over 3 quarters. The anonymized response data showed that junior team members felt their contributions were systematically undervalued. Internal promotion rates for analysts below the associate level had dropped to 0 in the current fiscal year, compared to 3 promotions in the same period 2 years prior. 2 of the 3 flagged analysts had now accepted preliminary conversations with competing firms. "These surveys self-select toward people with complaints," Marcus said. His voice was carefully calm. "Engaged employees are working, not filling out forms." "The response rate is 73%, Priya said. "That's not self-selection. That's a representative sample." "Still, it's qualitative data. It's quantitative engagement scoring with qualitative response tagging." I opened my own folder. "I've been running this survey infrastructure since 2018. I have 7 years of comparative data. This is the steepest 3-quarter decline on record." Marcus looked at me steadily. "You've been running the survey infrastructure since before you joined the firm." The other senior partners, who had spent the first 10 minutes of this meeting looking at their hands, were now looking at each other. "I want to address Saturday evening as well," I continued. Marcus's expression shifted fractionally. "I owe you an apology for that. I didn't recognize you." It was dark, the room was crowded. It was well lit. The room was not particularly crowded, and you snapped your fingers. Twice. I let that sit. "I'm not raising this to embarrass you. I'm raising it because the instinct behind that action, the immediate assignment of a stranger to a service category based on her appearance, is the same instinct that produces a 0 internal promotion rate and a 14-point engagement drop. It doesn't stay at charity dinners." One of the senior partners, a woman named Rhonda Chen, who had joined Meridian 4 years ago and who I had always respected for her directness, said, "How long have you been watching these numbers?" 3 months for the current trend. 7 years overall. "Why didn't you?" She stopped. Reconsidered. "What changed the timeline?" "Saturday night. Specifically, watching a managing director treat a guest at a firm-affiliated charity event as though she was invisible. That event, incidentally, benefits a foundation I chair." I turned back to Marcus. The program said so clearly. Table 1. My name on the seating card. A silence settled over the table that had a specific quality I had felt before in rooms like this one. The quality of people recalibrating what they understood to be true. "What exactly are you proposing?" asked the senior partner to Marcus's left. A man named Tom Hargrove, who specialized in late-stage deals and who had, I knew from the survey data, received the strongest positive feedback from the junior team of any senior staff member. "A culture initiative with teeth," I said. "Not a workshop, not a memo, a structured program. External facilitation. Revised feedback loops with guaranteed response times. A reinstated promotion pathway with clear and transparent criteria, and quarterly reporting directly to me on all of the above." "That's significant overhead," Marcus said. "We made $62 million last year. We can afford to invest in the people who made it." I paused. "There's also a structural change I want to discuss. I'll be attending leadership sessions, quarterly going forward. In person." Marcus leaned back in his chair. He was quiet for a moment in the way that people are quiet when they are deciding whether to fight or adapt. I had seen it before. I had learned to wait. "If I agree to this," he said finally, "what does accountability actually look like?" Specific metrics. Engagement scores back above the 7-year average by end of Q2. At least 2 internal promotions from the junior analyst pool by mid-year. Response time standards for all senior to junior communication, tracked automatically. Priya will own the reporting. The board will review it, and if the numbers don't move, then we revisit your contract. The silence this time was different, more final. "All right," Marcus said. "What do we do first?" We spent the next 2.5 hours working through the specifics. By the time the room cleared, we had a framework, an external facilitator identified, a timeline, and a set of commitments that were specific enough to be measurable and public enough to be real. Marcus didn't like all of it. The parts he liked least were probably the most important ones. But he signed the internal agreement, which was the only thing that mattered. Priya stopped me in the hallway on the way out. She looked, for the first time since I had known her, like someone who had put down a weight she had been carrying for a long time. "I've been trying to get a meeting with Marcus about the junior team data for 6 weeks, she said. "I know. I saw the calendar requests." She absorbed that. "I should have reached out to you directly. My contact information was not exactly broadcast." "That changes, too." I meant it. The invisibility that had protected my ownership in the early years had become, in some ways, a liability. A firm could not model transparent leadership when its majority owner operated entirely from the shadows. "Thank you for everything you've documented. It made this morning possible. Thank you for listening." I should have listened sooner. My sister was waiting in the lobby downstairs, where she had spent the morning working from her laptop in an armchair near the window. She looked up when I came out of the elevator. "Well, he's staying. On a very short leash with very clear conditions." "Is that the right call?" "Ask me in 6 months." I picked up my coat from the chair beside her. "Marcus is good at his job in the ways that show up in a quarterly earnings report. Whether he's willing to be good at the parts that don't show up in a quarterly earnings report, that I don't know yet. People can change when the alternative is sufficiently concrete, and if he doesn't, then I'll have significantly better documentation for the conversation that comes after this one." We walked out into the November air on Michigan Avenue, which had turned sharply cold overnight. My sister tucked her hands into her pockets. "You know what I keep thinking about," she said. "What?" "Grandma. If she could see you do that." Our grandmother, Carolyn Rhodes, had spent 32 years as a domestic worker in the suburbs of Cleveland. She had raised 2 children, including my mother, on a schedule that started at 5:30 in the morning and rarely ended before 8 at night. She had put my mother through a state school with money she saved in an actual envelope in the kitchen drawer. My mother had put me through a better school with the same discipline, the same envelope, a different kitchen. When I founded Clearwater Capital at 31, I named it after the lake near the summer camp my grandmother had saved to send my mother to for 2 weeks every August. She never saw a return on that investment beyond my mother's face on the drive home each year, which she always described as worth every penny. She died before I made my first serious deal. I had kept her photo on my desk every day since. "She would have said something very short and very accurate," I said. My sister laughed. "She would have said, well, obviously." Exactly. 6 months later, the numbers had moved. Not dramatically meaningful. Culture change is slow, and anyone who tells you otherwise is either lying or selling a consulting package, but genuinely. Engagement scores were up 9 points. Priya had facilitated 2 internal promotions, both well-deserved. One of them, the first-generation analyst, I had been watching with particular attention. He had just led the due diligence process on a mid-sized logistics deal that closed cleanly, and he had done it with the kind of thoroughness that suggested he had been waiting a long time for someone to ask him to do exactly that. One of the other 2 analysts, who had been talking to competing firms, had stayed. The third had left, which was not entirely a loss. The exit interview suggested the fit had genuinely been wrong, not a culture casualty, and her replacement was already adding something the team hadn't had before. Marcus was implementing the changes. Not enthusiastically, not with the particular energy of someone who had undergone a genuine conversion, but consistently and measurably, which was what I had asked for. He had stopped snapping his fingers in rooms. Whether that was a change in instinct or simply a change in calculation, I couldn't say. Perhaps it didn't matter. At scale, the December charity event for the Literacy Foundation was held at the same club. I wore the same outfit I had worn in November, which was a deliberate choice I made privately and mentioned to no one. My sister was back in Portland. I went alone. Marcus arrived shortly after I did. He crossed the room to where I was standing, by the same window that looked out over the golf course, now covered in the first light snow of the season. "Miss Rhodes," he said. "Marcus, I want to say something." "You don't have to." "I think I do." He looked out the window. "I didn't know who you were in November. That's true. But I also didn't try to know." I looked at you and decided in about half a second what category you belonged in. That's not an excuse. It's the thing I've been trying to understand since then. I waited. Priya has me reading the exit interviews. The old ones, going back 2 years. He was quiet for a moment. There's a pattern. There is. I created it. You accelerated it. It existed before you. You had an opportunity to change it and didn't. Until the consequences became personal. I looked at him. That's more self-awareness than most people manage. What you do with it now is the interesting question. He nodded once, slowly. He didn't look relieved. Exactly. He looked like someone who had received an honest answer instead of a comfortable one and was deciding to be grateful for it. He excused himself. I stood at the window a while longer, watching the snow come down over the fairway. Fine and steady. The kind that sticks. There was a young woman from the foundation staff standing near the silent auction table, looking slightly lost in the way that people look when they're attending their first event like this one and haven't quite figured out where they belong yet. I walked over to her. Her name tag said Deja, and she was there representing the after-school reading program in the South Side neighborhood where the foundation's pilot site was located. First time at one of these? I asked. She looked slightly alarmed. That obvious? Only a little. It gets easier. I picked up the bid sheet for the auction item nearest us, which was a weekend at a Wisconsin lake house, and signed my name. Tell me about the reading program. Her eyes changed. Okay, so we have 43 kids enrolled this semester, and the reading level gains are actually. She talked for 20 minutes. She had data. She had stories. She had the specific, detailed enthusiasm of someone who was doing exactly the work they were supposed to be doing and knew it. I made a note to have Priya look into whether Meridian's foundation giving had ever included direct support for the kind of grassroots program this young woman was describing. I suspected it hadn't. I suspected it should. When I left the club that night and walked to my car through the thin layer of snow on the parking lot, I thought about the word my grandmother used when she talked about her work. Not job, not career, work. The specific weight of that word, in her mouth, had never meant drudgery. It had meant investment. Every hour she spent in someone else's house was an hour building towards something she believed in, even when the person whose house it was could not have imagined what that something looked like from the outside. I had spent 11 years building a firm that most people in the industry had never heard of. I had structured it that way intentionally, for reasons that were once purely strategic and had since become something more complicated to explain. There was a version of this story where staying invisible was purely tactical. There was another version where it was partly something else, the instinct, learned early and deeply, not to take up space that hadn't been explicitly offered. I was still thinking about which version was more true. Probably they both were, in different proportions at different times. What I knew was this: the work mattered. The 41 people in that office on Michigan Avenue had mortgages and families and professional aspirations and the reasonable expectation that the place they went every day would treat their contributions as real. The 43 children in that South Side reading program were learning that words were tools, that stories were portable, that what you could read was a door you could always open. The young woman named Deja was doing the specific work of holding that door open. And she deserved to be in a room with people who understood what that was worth. I got in my car. I thought about my grandmother's face in the one photograph I had of her from her working years, taken outside a house in Shaker Heights, her coat buttoned against the cold, her expression exactly the same as it always was in every photograph: calm, private, certain. She had known something that took me years and a great deal of expensive trial and error to learn: that the person who serves is not the person who is less. That the work of building something, a firm, a family, a child who can read, is always the same work, regardless of what it looks like from the outside, regardless of what category a stranger assigns you to in the first half second before they've asked a single question. She had never once let anyone make her feel small. I was still learning how to be as good at that as she was, but I was working on it.